Just before we get into the time lapse here, I wanted to take you on a little tour of this scene. This file is available, you can find a link to it down below. It'll be a link to the Patreon, which is public, and then you can find a link right at the bottom of that post where you can download this file. You will want Blender 3.1 alpha. There's a few nodes in here, like some booleans and things, so a couple of things like the watering can and the chef's hat will not show up in 3.0, as well as a couple of other things like the bottle caps. So just to be aware of, you want 3.1. I wanted to make this video because there's a few little Easter eggs in here that I think are worth picking up, and you probably won't see them necessarily in the time-lapse. So when you find the file, you'll actually find it with the reflector turned on. This is a separate object. You can turn it off in the outliner. All this does is it bounces light back inside, so it doesn't show in rendered view, but it's just there. So if you do want to turn it off to have a look in the solid shading mode, then you can do. Alright, let's start at the bottom. There's a lot of fun stuff in here. For example, we have the pine cone, which is a sort of Christmas tree, mouse scale Christmas tree. And if you look at the nodes for this, is it's all generated procedurally. All of the it's called a scale, this section of the pine cone. You can find this is basically a box with some subdivisions, which is modified with a float curve. And then this is just on the violet axis, so that's fun. And then there's some fun stuff to get the actual tinsel itself using a spiral, and we're taking individual segments of that curve, modifying the Bezier handles to get the droop, and then just using that to instance on a star. It's actually a star node, this. So there we go, we have some thimbles. That's all pretty standard stuff, although a little bit of math, which some might find interesting. How to get the index offsetting. We do, of course, have some Easter egg Suzannes in here as well. These are our acorns, and I'll show you a few more Suzannes as well in a moment. A lot of stuff is made with matches, and I know there's a bit of a mismatch when it comes to scale. That was just kind of part of building a scene in this way. Something else you might want to have a look at is actually how we made the solder joints on the flue pipe, because this was taking elements from one object, separating them off, rescaling them, and then creating a new mesh from those elements. Blackberries, really simple to do, just a little cone object, subdivided, and then instance your icospheres on them. Now, if you use Poisson distribution, then you can set a small offset, and if you turn the density up really, really high, then you get this really nice packing look. Now, the mushrooms are our second use of Suzanne. She actually works really well, really surprisingly well as a mushroom, and you can have a look at how we've got that mushroom. I made sure on the Suzanne uses that you can kind of lerp between the original Suzanne and the modified one. A few things down here. I want to mention as well the batteries. These have a node version of the Nodevember logo. This is made by Nugget. Thanks to Alex for giving me that node group, so thanks to him. And then of course we have the cable coming across the front. This is one of the elements that I would advise you to, if you were making a scene like this, you would have a normal spline, right? A Bezier spline, something like that. And that would be art directable because you would have handles, and then you could still modify it through geometry nodes and give it this kind of the shape and the solidity. But the original mesh and the direction and the positioning, you could still do all by hand. So the postage stamps, that was actually a really interesting process, and I recommend that you have a look back through the streams to find this. These are three-dimensional Suzannes. It's the same original Suzanne model. You can see where we intersect there. It's another Suzanne on front. And the way that we did that, actually, it was by capturing her normals before we squashed her. So that's how we're able to get all of this nice woodcut look, and the screen tone. All of that is done based on the original normals before squashing. So that's a really exciting process that I want to get into, maybe do some tutorials on in the future. Moving up through here, we have a bunch of fairy lights, of course. That's one of the main features of the scene. And yeah, again, you'll see how I put them together. We have planes where we have a little bit of art direction, and we instance points on them and then generate this spline through them all. And we do, of course, have a little bit of intersection, which you will be able to find quite easily. But for general use, I think this actually works really well. It's much too complex of a shape for me to come in here and recommend you to make this, manually. But generating points on specific places and perhaps manually positioning the planes on which you create those points, that might be a good process for you to work with. Continuing up, we have a year in Provolone, And then on here we have a little fish tin, a little spam tin or sardine tin or something with a spam key. And this is full of, again, little wires that we've cropped inside the actual tin. So you can see that there. They all sort of cut off on the edge. And that's an interesting process as well. It uses some of my toolkit nodes. So do watch out for that when we're going through the time lapse. A little salt shaker lid with some copper strands and a popsicle stick with a pencil and some cribbage pegs at the top. That's making up our little banjo for the mouse, which is incidentally called Feta. Feta. And have a look at the chef's hat as well. When you have a look at the file, the chef's hat has some interesting stuff in it for how we created the pleats in the top, and then also how we actually bent the name Feta. I could have raycast it, but it was so close to the same diameter as our circle that you'd have ended up with some nasty stretching on the sides where it was pushed back too far. So what we did instead was we actually stretched it. We used one of the nodes from the toolkit, which changes it from cylindrical to Cartesian coordinates, and using that we're able to get this really nice bend with complete control. We have a little bit more phyllotaxis up here with our rosemary strands. Nice and easy process, and it's just a very simple Bezier curve, quadratic Bezier I think, that is skinned. Up here we have a node group which actually generates rubber bands, and you can see me use it twice, 3 times actually. So once on the Matchbox chest of drawers, once on the rosemary, and you're also going to find it on this toothbrush over here. So that's a special node group which is basically projecting the rubber band back towards whatever it's around. Have a little earring at the top. This is very simple, just instancing chain links on a curve line. So it's just, you know, have a look at how we've done all these little things when you get to have a look in the file. Lots of stuff going on the actual watering can itself. That's fairly simple. Actually, we could really do with having a weld modifier or something like that as a node. But you can see we have our E stuck on the front of it. That's just a standard raycast. We have a little knot, which is actually just 2 toruses. And then our cable, our rope, should I say, goes up over this spool. We've just filleted that corner and then back to a loop. And that was actually really easy to make these kind of offset loops, just with a very low resolution spiral. The bubble bath on top of the cup was very simple, just a deformed sphere. But the bubble bath is just very similar to how we did the blackberries, just spheres instanced on top of a cone. The legs of our mouse friend, of Feta, again, really simple actually. It's just a Bezier spline that we've manipulated and essentially changed the radius along its length. It's a very simple process. I recommend you check it out because it's a nice organic way of not quite sculpting, but you know, pretty close. And lastly, I want to show you the perfume bottle, because the perfume bottle at the back here, we have a pretty interesting shape. And all of this is super procedural. I'm using float curves to define one of these fluting patterns, which we have a bit of a complex shape on. But then we're also doing a little bit of maths to make sure that it's repeated around. I think I have this going around 7 times. But then we're also twisting it up the length. So it's a nice, easy process, but it does just take a little bit of foresight to know how to do it. So I hope this helps. I hope it's going to be an interesting file for you to have a look at. I hope you learn a lot from the file. There is a lot of nodes going in here, just over 7,000. So lots for you to get your teeth into. I hope you enjoy the time lapse. I hope you enjoy seeing the process be put together. A huge thank you to everybody who jumped in the streams with me while I was making this. It was really good to see people and hang out for a little while each day. And I think we put in around about 35, 36 hours in total over the 6 sessions that we did. And there were so many ideas in this scene that I definitely couldn't have come up with myself. So credits to Nugget for the timber material, as well as the Nodevember logo. Credits to Sharon from Just 3D Things for making the T-tag texture. Really lovely little process, making an SDF on there and a little bit marbled. Credits to the chat for all of the cheese puns for the books. We have Waiting for Gouda, we have A Year in Provolone, and we also have the cheddar and the rye bread. And of course, our mouse is called Feta, after much discourse. The process for making a big scene like this really is pretty much the same as making a big scene traditionally. We just go about making a whole bunch of assets. I mean, if you were working traditionally, you'd probably have an asset library that you would import from. But in our case, because we're doing everything from scratch with nodes in a single node tree, we needed to make a bunch of assets to begin. My process was to start with the back wall so that I could get a little bit of a sense of the you know, the scale and how the scene was going to go. So I used a pretty simple process of just arraying a bunch of slats to get this kind of lath and plaster look. And then I had a really high resolution grid behind it, and I used the proximity from the slats to control where I had displacement. So I was able to displace my plaster through the gaps in between, and that just gave a really nice sort of more realistic, more natural look of plaster pushed through laths in the wall. Now, rather than working directly into the scene, you know, I didn't build the set directly. I did go in and actually make a whole bunch of assets. So you'll see me doing that throughout the first part of this video, is just making assets, just working on my key assets. Things like the main fairy lights. We had the stove itself with like the flue pipe. We had the stool. We had a bunch of slightly smaller assets, kind of mid-level assets. I made placeholders for books to begin with before I actually made the book assets, but they were fine. I made the books to more or less the same scale. We also made the pine cone for the Christmas tree, and we made the kitchen dresser, the bed, the cup, the perfume bottle, stuff like that, right? The big stuff, the big moves. And then we actually built the scene itself. So the scene is super simple. We have a floor, which actually that one is less simple than you might think. So if you get the file, check out the floor. It's sort of made of these boards, which are all the same. But then we've gone in and we've done a little bit of like post instance work. So we've realized the instances with a bunch of additional attributes on them. A little bit of maths to do that, a little bit of work to do that. If you have the toolkit, that is just the copy on points node. That's all I did. It's all wrapped up in a single node group. So then after the instances get realized and they get passed out, you have access to things like the original position of the points and the original rotation, stuff like this, as well as the index. And you can use the index to drive the ID, not the seed, but the ID. So that's quite important. The ID, if you have a flat ID across a whole bunch of points, they're going to get the same random value. And this basically means that we can use random values to control the rotation center, the rotation axis, or the rotation angle of our mesh. And because we're taking our rotation center actually from the original positions, it means that we have all of our boards bending around their own centers by a random amount in a random direction. So it's a little bit of maths, but it allows you to get this really nice, quite, you know, easy way of building up a whole bunch of variation amongst similar objects. You can find the exact same process happened on the stamps actually on the wall. So all of these were instanced, but then I was doing that through the copy on points node, so that it was really easy for me to then bend them sort of arbitrarily. Now, because the stamps were actually made of a whole bunch of different sections, we had the crown, and because they were 3D, right, they weren't 2D images. So we had the crown with all of its parts, and we had the Suzanne head, and we had this grid for the main square. And then we also had that sort of serrated outer border that was made with some curves. So there's a lot going on there. And because the way for us to actually do all of our bending is to realize them, they all get squished into the same thing. So in the shader, the object info random socket, that will just give a flat value because they're all the same sort of realized geometry. And if you use the geometry random per island socket, then you're going to come into a different issue, is that every single one of those individual bits of geometry has a different seed. So for me to get a random color per stamp rather than, you know, per jewel on the hat or something like that, because obviously postage stamps all come in different colors based on different, you know, different prices. So to do that, I was actually able to take the index passed out from the copy on points node and take that across to my group output, and then that is my stamp index. So I was just able to use that stamp index to actually control the different colors of different stamps. Now weirdly, when you pass out a random value through the group output as an output attribute into a shader and use a white noise texture on it, the white noise texture kind of glitches. I'm not really sure. I'm not sure if it's a bug or if it's a sort of known limitation at the moment. But essentially, we were able to quite quickly get the bent floorboards and the bent stamps. Very similar process, just a few nodes and a few vector rotate nodes. And the walls are very simple, and the top as well. To get the bevel, I wanted to make sure that I had a quadrilateral, which I filleted, and I just extruded it along a line. So grab your line as your path, and then your quadrilateral as the profile curve, and then just use that on a curve to mesh. So that's all fairly straightforward to actually put together your main scene. There is a little bit of passing out custom UVs, but you've seen me do that before in different videos. But once the scene actually starts coming together, you know, you put in the big things. So I think I started with the dresser to get a little bit of a sense of scale. And then it was the stove itself, and you just build these things up, you know, put in the floors, put in the ladder, because we had the crochet hook with the matches, that was the base ladder, and then we had a comb for the top ladder, and we were just using placeholders for the books at the beginning, but essentially those platforms went in, and because the platforms went in, we could put in the brackets as well, and these were all stuff that was manually positioned. Then there was a certain amount of needing to do the smaller stuff, right, that was a little bit more procedural. So granted, a lot of it was very hand positioned, and that's, I think, why this scene runs so quickly, because we don't actually have a huge amount of geometry. We kind of have a lot of one-offs. And that being said, this is not what geometry nodes is good for. Like, I know I'm doing it, and I'm pushing geometry nodes really hard to do these things, but it's really not designed for this sort of work. Doing individual one-off assets, which have a very specific outcome, is not what proceduralism is good for. In that case, you know, you would be so much faster doing it with traditional modeling. A lot of people came into the streams and was like, why aren't you doing this traditionally? And to be fair, it's just because it was Nodevember. There are so many better processes that are much more suited to that kind of workflow out there, and Blender does them excellently. For me, this was just a case of trying to stretch myself, trying to see what I could do with the nodes, and ultimately trying to come up with a nice picture at the end of it. Now, I'm pretty happy with how it came out. Actually, I'm really proud of how it came out. And there's a lot of stuff which I learned in here, and I think some of the cool ones are workflow advice. Now, I actually didn't learn too much about what I wanted from geometry nodes. I was more kind of focused on using the tools rather than being particularly critical. There were a few things that held me back a little bit, although we did have an add-on actually written for us during the stream, which was amazing, and that was the copy cursor location add-on. So basically I could just right click in a vector and use the 3D cursor location. So that really sped me up in a lot of times. Things like positioning the ends of Beziers, where I could just quickly right click in the 3D viewport. There is a Control-Alt-C or Control-Alt-V operator, which allows you to copy an entire vector. But the issue is that the 3D cursor vector and whatever vector you're copying into may not be actually the same kind of vector. You know, we have ones which end in degrees, ones that end in meters, and we just also have like the numerical ones. If your array type does not match, that Control-C, Control-V, or sorry, Control-Alt-C, Control-Alt-V will not actually work. So the add-on that was made by Joshua, who makes Serpens, amazing that he was able to do that. And also there is a patch by Eric that is able to do this. I think there is some debate about whether or not it's worth adding, but I think for geometry nodes workflows it probably would be. Another thing that I'd really like to see added is 3D viewport gizmos. Oh, the amount of just tweaking things, and because of the scale I was working to as well, that was a big mistake. Working to real scale for a mouse house, very stupid, because I was moving stuff by individual millimeters often, and even if you hold shift while you're dragging something, it's going to be snapping to centimeters, which is like a small unit. If you change your scene scale, it doesn't change the rate that you will snap to stuff. It's still going to be snapping to centimeters, even if your outputs are actually reading millimeters. So it's not really useful, that. I suppose if I did need it to be real scale, and realistically for this I probably didn't, I could have done it 10 times or even 100 times the size, and it would have probably made it a lot easier for me to actually use the inputs. I think anybody who watched the live streams will testify that I spent probably several hours overall just typing in, oh, is this going to be 6 millimeters or 7 millimeters, or oh wait, no, it's going to be 6.5, because I was trying to get things aligned. And this brings me on to another point. Using multiple different objects would have actually allowed me to use 3D viewport control, right? I'd be able to translate, rotate, scale things in the 3D viewport. Now, this was a conscious decision. I know I've talked about this one before, especially with the flower scene, the splash screen, but in this one it actually became a little bit more of a problem because the scene is huge. There's so many assets going on, and almost every single one needed manually positioning. So combine the fact that the viewport, while the 3D viewport was fast, the node viewport was not fast. We have just over 7,000 nodes by the end, and it started to get a little bit choppy around sort of 2,000 to 3,000 really. So you can imagine, we're running at sort of 15, 16 FPS. The sliders don't like updating because the whole node tree has to update, and you've got, potentially 3, 4, 5 seconds of update time going on. Break up your scenes. That would be my main advice. I've never actually seen any other people working in this kind of ridiculous paradigm of putting everything in the same node tree. Everyone else does seem to know to not do this. So maybe I'm preaching to the choir, but breaking up your node trees is going to make your life a whole lot easier. Just keep individual assets as individual objects. You won't get such a pretty node screenshot at the end of it, but you will also enjoy making your scene a lot more. And it will be faster, and it will be much more pleasurable for you to do. I also want to touch on the sort of frames versus groups thing, which comes up quite a lot, especially when people see these big node trees. It's like, oh, why didn't you just put each object into a group? And for me, grouping stuff is not an answer. Groups are great for tools. Groups are amazing for wrapping stuff that has a specific function. And you might say like, oh, well, you know, one of these things makes a specific thing and it only has one output. So surely it's got a very, it's got a very narrow period of time that you want to use it. And it also doesn't need to have all of its data exposed. You could just put that into a group and save yourself some time. True, you are right. But sometimes I just want to copy a bunch of nodes. Or if you do have a look at the node tree, if you find that either on Twitter or Patreon or blenderartist.org, you'll see the node tree and you'll see that there's a whole bunch of noodles, obviously, which connect to the main join geometries. There are two main ones at the start and finish. And then there's also a whole bunch of really long noodles that connect random parts of the tree. And this is where data is talking to each other. And I did not know when and where different data was going to talk to each other necessarily until I was building the scene. And this is one of the great things about having frames where things are exposed, is you can see stuff. You can copy either data, literally like copying the numbers directly, or copying a whole bunch of nodes which do a process that you want to do again. Or in a lot of these cases, actually grabbing data from a node output. So this might be grabbing a whole bunch of different parts of meshes to put into a join geometry to stick through a geometry proximity or a raycast, something like that, where you're actually wanting to take data to control another asset. Now, of course, this is just a workflow thing. And I think it's less relevant when you are also splitting up your node tree, right? Because you're going to have an object which does a thing rather than, in this case, an object which does like 50 things. So I think generally speaking, you can get away with having these sort of one-level trees and just use your tools as groups. So if you use the toolkit, I know I go on about it a lot, but I literally would not have been able to do this node tree without it. And it really speeds up my workflow, and everybody who I know uses it also finds it really speeds up their workflow. So I do recommend it, and not just in like a buy my product way, but like a, this is actually useful, and it pretty much doubles the amount of things that you can do, maybe even more, because a lot of my tools are much more high level. So it's much more kind of artist centric tools in the toolkit. But if you are making your own tools, which I encourage you to do, then you should have those tools which do a thing. They can be a group, because then you can reuse them. It's much easier. But generally, when you want to be accessing the data, accessing different parts of a mesh, sticking stuff together, maybe using stuff elsewhere, it's just nice to have it as one level. You have access to all of those things and you can see it. That's one of the big things for me, being able to see, visualize the data. I kind of mentioned this in the introduction when we were having a look at the scene itself, but art direction is difficult with pure proceduralism. And somebody mentioned this to me on Twitter as well, saying, isn't it more difficult to achieve results with a set composition when you're working procedurally? Because you can't just position something easily, you can't position things easily, and if you have a whole bunch of different things which are randomly distributed, that's random, right? You can't define it unless you're just clicking through seed values until you find something you like. But that's more about luck, really, than artistry. And then you start getting to the whole philosophical discussion about if you're making a system that generates the artwork, are you the artist or are you just making the system? And who's the artist? And I see this one quite a lot with like machine learning and AI and stuff. It's like, who's actually the author? Who's creating the artwork? Just because you created a situation in which an artwork could arise doesn't necessarily make you an artist. And that, I think, is where geometry nodes is going to really come in helpful for a lot of people, because if you build systems intelligently, if you build in that art directable control, whether that is using a curve to control something or whether it is using a mesh to control something. Give you some examples, right? The wires across the front of the floor, I had to position the endpoints and the handles, and then after that I was randomizing the position, changing the spline type to a Bezier, changing the handle types to free, so that I would get that nice curvature. And it was all just a little bit difficult. However, 90% of that process I would still do with geometry nodes. Actually taking a curve and randomizing the position, making it smooth, making sure that it can't go below a certain level with its points so that you can set limits, constrain its randomization to within a certain region, just like stuff in real life is, right? You know, it sits on top of a table rather than going through it. And then also taking your curve and sort of skinning it, putting a mesh on it, whether that is just a circle or a custom profile, like you'll see on the fairy lights. They had like a dual cable as well as the headphone cable. That was a dual cable. So all of that stuff I would still do with geometry nodes. However, I would exchange my meticulously positioning a Bezier curve procedurally, or, you know, in this case actually not procedurally, do that with a real curve, because then you still have all of this curve control in the 3D viewport that you can art direct. That's the important thing. And you see this as well with the fairy lights. The position of the fairy lights is based on some dummy meshes. I didn't just say scatter a bunch of points on the back wall, the sides walls and the bottom of the books. What I did was I actually created specific surfaces. I made these dummy grids that I could position. Now I was positioning these with geometry nodes rather than manually, which was a pain, but the thinking still applies, right? If you had a 3D mesh, and maybe you do want to do it procedurally, but maybe you want to integrate a little bit more manual control so that you can maybe override one of the procedural things and use a specific grid. And it saved me from having to do a whole load of masking to make stuff on the right side of stuff, because of course on the back wall, there's all of the laths and plaster, so there's all these different surfaces in different directions. I specifically wanted stuff to stick on the, you know, the inside face of that wall. Much easier for me to do that just by putting a grid across the front of it instead. And rather than needing to use geometry proximity to avoid putting points directly behind the books or stuff like that, I can actually just not have a grid there. I just used, you know, like several individual grids on the back wall, several underneath the books, and was able to instance my points on those grids directly. So if this was done in a more useful workflow oriented way, then you've got all of this art directable control where you can move these planes or these mesh objects, and it's going to generate wires that fit a certain rule set around that. Just taking a sort of step back to something I mentioned earlier, don't do as I do. Don't make everything procedurally that doesn't really need it. If you can make your fairy light faster by hand by just, you know, adding a cylinder and then extruding it really quickly, do that. Don't go and make it all with curves and maths and things like that, because there's no point. You're not gaining anything by doing that. For Nodevember, a free pass because it's all about the flex. But in general workflows, don't do that. I think a lot of people message me like, proceduralism is cool, but it seems really slow. Why are you doing it? And it's like, you shouldn't use it all the time. I use it all the time because I'm showing people what it can do. And I'm showing people how it can fit in with their workflows and things like that. But no, generally, if I'm doing client work, I'm not using proceduralism all the time. I'm using it for specific things where it's actually going to, you know, help me. In those cases, it is faster to either do it procedurally in the first case, or if it's not faster to do it first with geometry nodes or procedurally in general, then the only reason that I would decide to do it is if I thought that there may be revisions from the client, in which case making changes to the scene that I need to have like precipitate down through all of these systems. You know, imagine if you positioned all of your cables really meticulously and it's beautiful, and then your client comes back and they say, oh wait, actually I want a third book. I want this to be a taller composition, and instead of having 2 platform books, I want 3. Well, suddenly you're in a bit of hot water because you're going to have to make all of your cables again, position all of these curves, position all of these extra things. So if you have all of your cables on, you know, dummy meshes and things like that, rather than being manually positioned, then you can just simply add another book, which is fine now because you can just move your dummy meshes. The cables are all going to update. You have a rule set in place which is going to allow that change to precipitate through your project. And I think that's the important thing. Find where proceduralism fits in with a workflow. It's not about the proceduralism is your workflow. For most of us doing normal kind of more generalist work, proceduralism picks up the slack. It doesn't take the whole workflow. I think a lot of people think that geometry nodes is like the future of Blender, and that's not true. It's not going to change Blender fundamentally. It just adds another way for certain types of people, certain types of artists to interact with the tools. And sure, it's going to expand what Blender is able to do, because it means that a lot of people, kind of like me, like tech artists, technical directors, they're going to be able to build tools and build workflows and help people, engineer pipelines in Blender in a broader sense. But it's never going to take over from a very specific asset being made, maybe through sculpting or general modeling, whether that's hard surface or organic modeling. It's not going to really take over from rigging or things like that. And things may be automated to a certain degree by your TD or your tech artists, but it's not going to take you out of a job. I think some people are worried that they're going to lose out on being able to use Blender because they don't know nodes. And it's like, you can still use Blender because you're already using it now. These tools that you're using, they ain't going anywhere. The only good thing about nodes is that it allows a different type of paradigm to exist within the software. And that is incredible. That is amazing. And that is really empowering, especially to people like me who are more sort of system orientated like that. Because it means that we can build things which are much larger than we may have had the either patience or vision to maybe do before. Take a scene like this. I would never have had the patience to 3D model it. Not all of it, for sure. I mean, it would have been certainly faster for me to have modeled 20 or 30 or 40% of this, where I had specific assets and I could have just sat down on it in 10 minutes rather than an hour. But a lot of this stuff, positioning the wires, positioning the floorboards and manipulating them, positioning the stamps and manipulating them, I couldn't have done that non-procedurally. I couldn't have done that with a destructive workflow. It wouldn't have worked for me. I know some people have the patience to sculpt that kind of detail, but that's just, I wouldn't have done that. So there are definitely some things that geometry nodes, it allows you to thrive in certain ways. Being able to generate large scattering systems or distributing systems, or manipulating lots of different pieces of data at the same time. But I would caution you against trying to do everything with geometry nodes. And I know whenever I say this in a video, there's always people commenting like, Erin, it's just you doing this. But I know that there's probably someone else as well watching my videos thinking, I've got to do everything with nodes. And that is not the message that I want to share. It's all about finding a workflow that allows you to create the work that you want to make. Ultimately, the reason I teach is because I want people to make better art, and I want people to make art that they feel expresses themselves better. That's the goal here. It's not about trying to be evangelical about nodes or, being just really rigorous about this workflow. It's about expanding the potential of the individual artists who watch. I really hope you'll find a little bit of utility in these node trees. Do feel free. I know there's a lot of toolkit nodes in these files. It's not the whole add-on, of course, and it's not the actual add-on part of it. But if you do want to just pull the ETK nodes out from these files, do feel free. I don't mind you doing that at all. And if you find them useful, consider applying the add-on, because obviously you won't get updates if you're just pulling them out of the project files. I had an absolute blast this Nodevember, and I'm probably going to just carry on doing what I do. I can't really see myself stopping now it's over. I imagine there's going to be a lot more streams on this channel because that was a really fun part of Nodevember, and a whole load of projects. Have a look on the Discord, join the Discord, linked in the description, because we're going to have some fun projects coming up. We're going to have a game jam this month on the Discord, so definitely join in for that. There's going to be prizes. And if you are interested in just generally proceduralism, whether that is geometry nodes, Sverjock, or shaders, or maybe some other things, I'm thinking of branching into Unreal. I am potentially going to touch on Houdini, but who knows? Pretty confident about Unreal though. I think that's going to be a fun time. We may do some bigger projects with more softwares next year. I kind of want to take this YouTube thing a little bit more seriously, push it a little bit further, push myself a little bit further, and yeah, we'll see where it takes us. Hope you're all well. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.